Hey guys, how's it going? Duty, I'm back with another video. In today's video, we're going to discuss one of the most infamous serial killers of all time. There's currently a dramatization played by Evan Peters on Netflix about Jeffrey Dahmer. And so this is going to be a mix of research that I've done on the Jeffrey Dahmer case, as well as elements from this show that I have to say is incredibly acted. But before we get into that, I just want to give a shout out to my patron of the day, Finn Jones. Thank you so much, Finn, for being a patron. I really do appreciate it. If you would like to become a patron, where you can get lots of behind the scenes, lots of bonus content, all the Duty Rhino goodness on a Patreon for just £1 a month, then head over to my Patreon. It just helps me out as a creator, supports the content that I create. Also, if you want to like, share and subscribe, that would be absolutely amazing. Okay, Jeffrey Dahmer. Between the years of 1978 and 1991, Jeffrey Dahmer took the lives of 17 men. Most of these men were African American, and they were mainly targeted in gay bars. A lot of the victims were homosexual men. He would lure them back to his house or apartment with the promise of money or sex, sometimes both. He would then give them alcohol, which was laced with drugs. From here, he would often strangle them to death and then sodomize the bodies, cut up the bodies, and eat the bodies. More often than not, he would keep parts of them, like their skulls or their genitalia, as like trophies. And throughout the whole process, he would take Polaroid pictures to document this process, and he would often look at these photos for satisfaction and gratification. It is thought that Dahmer was quite meticulous with his victims, and that he targeted individuals that were like on the fringes of society and would, you know, not get a fair shake with the law. You know, obviously there are a lot of racial tensions during this time and homophobia, which all contributed to him getting away with it for so long. That's one thing in the Netflix shows incredibly well, was just the fact that the police were not interested because either the victims were African American or the victims were homosexual, or a combination of the two. They were so dismissive, and that is epitomized perfectly later on when, you know, Jeffrey Dahmer gets to killing a lot of people in succession, and he is living in this block of flats, and his neighbor, you know, she's getting this awful smell through the vents, she's hearing men screaming, she's noticing that people are disappearing, and she warns the police, she calls the police time and time and time again, and they just ignore her. And there is one case in particular, which I will get to in just a moment, that is just beyond comprehension. A fuck up in policing like you would not believe, to do with a 14-year-old victim of Jeffrey Dahmer's. But anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. I do apologize. Jeffrey Dahmer murdered his first victim shortly after graduating from high school. In June of 1978, he picked up a hitchhiker, Stephen Hicks, a 19-year-old, and he took him back to his parents' house. Now, Jeffrey plied this man with alcohol and tried to make advances on him, which were rejected. And once this rejection happened, Stephen wanted to leave immediately. And Jeffrey has this thing about people leaving him. It's like, it's a psychological issue that if you try to leave him, he will stop you. And, well, Jeffrey Dahmer caved Stephen's head in with a barbell/dumbbell barbell plate thing, and once he was on the ground, strangled him with a barbell. Initially, Dahmer dismembered his body and put them into plastic bags and buried them in the garden, apparently, although this, as far as memory serves, wasn't shown in the Netflix show, but from research I've done, apparently this is what he did first. He later dug up those remains, dried them out by putting them into the oven because he wanted to smash them into pieces, but he realized that the bone marrow was like sticky, and so wouldn't powder. So he put all of the bones and remains into the oven to dry them out, and then smashed them to pieces with a sledgehammer to then scatter the ashes, if you like, around a wooden ravine. And I believe there was also many traces in his back garden of his parents' home. Jeffrey would not kill again for 9 years. This was, oddly, another Stephen Tuomi. Now, this is a very interesting one because they're in a hotel room, and from the show's perspective, basically he went to drug this man and accidentally mixed up the drinks and drugged himself. And so in a desperate attempt to kind of rectify his mistake, he then drugs Stephen, blacks out, and wakes up with bloodied, bruised hands, and Stephen has seemingly been, well, beaten horrifically to death. From there, Jeffrey goes out of the hotel room and purchases a large suitcase and stuffs Stephen's body into that suitcase so that he can transport his body from this hotel. He brought Stephen's body to his grandmother's basement where he was living at the time and began dismembering and masturbating on the corpse of Stephen before disposing of Stephen's remains. His grandmother, was aware, sort of, but not totally. So she picked up on, there was men coming home late, they were getting drunk, they were making lots of noise, and she was, she didn't like it at all, but she obviously didn't pick up on the fact that he was drugging them to kill them and then dismember their bodies. There was even a potential victim in the show that Jeffrey brings him back to his grandmother's house and drugs him, and then the grandmother comes downstairs and notices that, the guy is completely out of it and insists on staying with him, literally like a guardian angel protecting him from Jeffrey, her own grandson. Stays with him till the morning until he kind of, wakes up to a point where he can walk assisted, puts him on a bus, is then freed from Jeffrey's clutches, if you like. So his grandmother actually saved someone unknowingly. In September of 1989, Jeffrey Dahmer managed to escape true justice in the most unbelievable fashion, whereby a 13-year-old boy escaped from Jeffrey and ran back home, told his parents once the drugs had worn off that essentially, Jeffrey had molested him, and so Jeffrey was arrested, on charges of molestation and sexual assault of a 13-year-old boy. Now, weirdly, the judge was very much on Jeffrey's side in that, he saw him as an alcoholic that needed help, and that this, because he's so young, this shouldn't be the end of his life kind of thing. And so he lightened his sentence to a 1-year sentence whereby he could still work. So he would only have to report to the prison to sleep at night and then still go to work in the morning to, work 40 hours a week. And they wouldn't even inform the workplace as to the fact that he was technically in prison for molesting a child, all because, this judge just wanted to give him a second chance. And the fact that he gave this man a second chance would ultimately lead to 10 or 12 more people dying, which is just absolutely tragic. But also, seemingly, the judge didn't have much time for the fact that the family was of a Laotian descent, and, like, for example, the father tries to speak out in broken English in the courthouse, and the judge just has no time for it and asks for the eldest son, who speaks fluent English, to speak on his behalf, completely belittling the father, and just essentially tosses this case aside, considering the depravity and, it's a 13-year-old boy being molested, and this judge just essentially, to the best of his ability, while still following the letter of the law, threw the case out, essentially. Dahmer did plead guilty, but he claimed that he thought that the boy was much older. Jeffrey's grandmother had actually paid bail for Jeffrey whilst this case was going on, And whilst he was waiting for his sentence to come through, he actually murdered someone else in his grandmother's basement in March of 1989. It was 26-year-old Anthony Lee Sears, an aspiring model. He, drugged him, murdered him, cut him up, sodomized him, photographed it, and disposed of his body parts. Over the next 2 years after he had served his year sentence, Jeffrey's killing accelerated exponentially. He would go on to kill another 13 people. 13 people that could have easily, in all honesty, been saved had the judge have done a better job, had the police done a better job up to this point. Now, Jeffrey at this point was using all sorts of different chemicals to try and clean the remains, to boil or melt the flesh away from the bones so that he could keep them for trophies. And he would also infamously try to turn his victims into zombies so that they wouldn't leave him. And he would do this by drilling holes into their heads and pour or inject acid or boiling water to try and essentially lobotomize his victims. By this point, he's moved into an apartment. This was in a very impoverished area, a majority African American area, and it is theorized that Jeffrey did this on purpose to assist him with his targets, basically. Now, on May 27th, 1991, his neighbor called the police because she found a naked boy running around in the streets, seemingly docile, completely out of it. And the police came trying to communicate with the boy, but he just couldn't communicate. And Jeffrey came back from getting alcohol from the shop, I believe. Basically, this boy tried to escape. This boy was 14 years old, and he was actually the brother of the 13-year-old boy that Jeffrey had molested a few years prior. But the boy claims in the show that, his family were poor and needed money, and Jeffrey offered him money for photographs, much like he did his brother at the time. And the boy unfortunately went along to Jeffrey's apartment and became one of his victims. But Jeffrey left the apartment, and the boy saw an opportunity, even in his zombified state, to escape. And the police were flagged down, and the neighbor was, this is a young boy, what is going on here? Jeffrey comes back and manages to convince the police that this boy, 14-year-old boy, is in fact his drunk 19-year-old boyfriend, and that they just had a fight and that he just needs to go home and lay down. So the police, and this is what I was saying earlier about the case, it's just unbelievable. The police led this boy, assisted this boy getting back into Jeffrey Dahmer's home. So they literally brought him back to Jeffrey Dahmer's house. And they alluded to the fact that they were just going to have a little quick look around, but they didn't really look around. And if they'd just done even half of a search, they would have discovered the corpse of Tony Hughes, who was a deaf aspiring model. And in the show, it's very interesting, that victim particularly, which I'll get to in just a moment. But yeah, the police led that 14-year-old boy back into Jeffrey Dahmer's home to be murdered, when they could have saved him, they could have discovered Tony's body, and they could have blew the whole thing wide open. Admittedly still late, because the neighbor had been calling even up to this point, but they could have ended it all there. But they didn't, because they thought that there was gay stuff going on and they wanted to just get out of there as quickly as possible. Now, as I said, there was a body in there, Tony Hughes. Now, Tony Hughes was a deaf African-American who was an aspiring model, and in the show it goes through, his whole kind of life and his struggles with being deaf and being rejected, etc. And seemingly he dated Jeffrey Dahmer for a short period of time, and it almost looked like it was going to be a turning point in Jeffrey's life. But when Tony gets up one morning after staying at Jeffrey's overnight to go to work, Jeffrey thinks that he is abandoning him, and because of this, slips back into his murderous ways and kills Tony. Now, before Jeffrey Dahmer was finally arrested, he would go on to kill 4 more victims. So that just, this is the frustration with this case, right? There were so many points that the police could have stopped this, that judge could have stopped this. And every time they failed to, it wasn't even though one life is too much, it wasn't like another victim. So because they didn't do their job and didn't suspect anything, because they were so put off by the thought of homosexuality, you know, that 14-year-old boy died. Tony's body wasn't discovered when it was laying there decomposing in Jeffrey's bedroom. And because they didn't stop it at that point, 4 more people died at Jeffrey Dahmer's hands. But it would all come to an end on July 22nd of 1991, when a potential victim, Tracy Edwards, managed to escape. And when he finally broke free of Jeffrey's clutches, sprints down the road and actually gets intercepted by police who just see this man running down the road with handcuffs on, because Jeffrey tried to handcuff him. You know, he says like, oh my God, this crazy guy is trying to kill me, you need to help. So they go back to Jeffrey's apartment in the guise of, we need to get a key for this guy who's got a handcuff on so we can take his handcuffs off. And they just want to look around, and obviously there's this putrid, horrible smell because there's all these decaying bodies and just horridness going on inside Jeffrey's apartment. And they discover Polaroids of all of Jeffrey's victims when looking for the key for Tracy's handcuffs. And from there, they open the fridge and they find a severed head, they find skulls, they find genitalia, they find bones, they find a vat of decomposing bodies in acid, and it all just falls apart. And they arrest Jeffrey Dahmer. He pleads guilty within the interviews, you know, the police interviews. He just wants to tell them everything because he believes that he deserves death. He just openly tells them everything. You know, in the interview tapes, he tells them all of the intricate details that he can. He just comes completely clean with it all. And I find you get this a lot with serial killers. It's almost like a pride thing, you know. It's like, okay, I've done my catalogue of horrors and now I want it to be published. You know, they never want to like take it to the grave or anything. Well, some of them do, but a lot of them are, you know, just kind of almost gloating with this kind of stuff, you know, which is absolutely horrifying. On February 15th of 1992, Jeffrey was found guilty of his crimes. Now, in the court case, he did actually try to plead not guilty by insanity, but the jury came back and said, look, this is so meticulous, there's no way you're insane. You're of able mind and you did this because you are evil, not because you are insane. And so he was given 15 consecutive life sentences, and then a 16th was added on later in May, about 3 months later. Now, Dahmer was eventually murdered in prison on November 28th of 1994 by a fellow inmate, Christopher Scarver. Now, Scarver beat him and another inmate to death with a metal bar, and they were left to do like some work tasks within the prison. And then Scarver later said that actually he was enabled to do this because the guards just left them to it. But yeah, I mean, there are many things that I haven't gone over. For example, Jeffrey's childhood. Apparently he was a normal bubbly child up to the age of 4, then had an operation for a double hernia, and his father believes that the anesthetic that was used perhaps gave him brain damage, because after the age of 4 he was never the same. And, you know, he was a very odd child. In the show, as it is depicted, he began showing some slightly concerning tendencies when it came to, you know, killing animals and stuff. And then his father, in an attempt to bond with his son, got him into taxidermy. Now, obviously, for the information we know about serial killers and that was probably a bit of a misstep, because carving up dead animals, learning anatomy and all that sort of stuff doesn't tend to end well if they have a psychopathic gene within them. Yeah, obviously it's entirely up to you as a person to decipher that for yourself as to, you know, was he born this way? Was it something that happened to him? Was it, you know, nature or nurture? It's an age-old question, you know, and I'd love to know your thoughts on that down below. Also, he spent a little bit of time in the army where he would train to be a field medic, and it was there that he discovered the uses of drugs to knock people out. So it was actually his time in the army where he learnt the information he needed to administer drugs to his victims, which became such a massive part of his MO. As well as he was, kicked out of uni after one semester, he also had a few misdemeanors and other things on his criminal record, like he masturbated in public at a fair, he exposed himself to 2 young boys. So there is a lot with the Jeffrey Dahmer case. It goes very deep, but I just wanted to really focus on the victims and what happened to them in this video. I also highly recommend that you watch the Dahmer series. Being completely transparent, I'm only 8 episodes in out of 10, so I still have a few episodes to go myself, but I'm thoroughly enjoying the series. It is very well acted in my opinion, and from between my research and watching the show, I feel like it's a good depiction of what was going on then. I hope that you enjoyed this video, and if you did, if you could leave me a like and subscribe. If you want to support me any further, you could always, for £1 a month, become a patron. And yeah, I just wanted to thank you all for joining me on this video, and I'm going to close out this video a little bit differently. I'm going to name the 17 victims. Sweet one, geese. Stephen Hicks, 19. Stephen Tuomi, 24. Jamie Doxteter, 14. Richard Guerrero, 25. Anthony Lee Sears, 26. Raymond Lamont Smith, 33. Edward W. Smith, 27. Ernest Miller, 22. David Thomas, 23. Curtis Straughter, 19. Errol Lindsay, 19. Anthony Hughes, 31. Conorak Synthesomphone, 14. Matt Turner, 20. Jeremiah Weinberger, 23. Oliver Lacey, 23. Joseph Braidhoft, 25.